The alarm did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a countdown. I was standing on the observation deck of the station when the signal cut through every channel at once, overriding music, overriding chatter, overriding the calm hum of 1,000 ordinary conversations. My name is Elena Voss, and I was the human liaison assigned to the Galactic Council that day, which meant I was the one standing closest to the screen when the message from the High Chamber appeared. It was not a request, it was a verdict. The delegate who spoke was called Sask Oren, a tall being with silver skin and eyes that never blinked. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words moved through the chamber, like something already decided long before he opened his mouth. He said that humanity had grown too fast. He said our technology had crossed a line that other species were not permitted to cross without permission. He said the council had voted, and the vote was final. Humanity would surrender its research on defense systems. Humanity would accept permanent limits on ship speed, weapons design, and computing power. Humanity would answer to an oversight committee that would review every decision we made from that day forward. If we refused, he said, correction would follow. I remember how quiet the room became. Not from fear, from calculation. Every human officer in that chamber went still in the exact same way, like a held breath spreading through all of us at once. Our ambassador, a calm man named Julian Ashcombe, stood and thanked the council for their patience. He said humanity would consider the terms carefully. He said we valued peace above all things. I watched his face as he said it, and I saw nothing. Not anger, not fear, just a flat, practiced calm, the kind you only get from someone who has already made up his mind and is simply being polite on the way out the door. We left the chamber in silence. No one spoke in the hallway. No one spoke in the elevator. It was only when we reached the transport bay, doors sealed, engines humming, that Julian turned to me and said 4 words. Get everyone home now. I did not ask what that meant. I already knew. Within an hour, every human ship docked at the council station received the same short message, encrypted, unsigned, sent through a channel that should not have existed. It contained a single word: prepare. I had served with the fleet for 11 years by then. I had trained beside pilots, engineers, and analysts who joked about budget cuts and long shifts and bad coffee, the same as anyone. I never once believed we were hiding something enormous. I assumed, like most people did, that we were still catching up to the older species, still years behind their engines, their shields, their weapons. I was wrong, and I was about to find out exactly how wrong. Julian did not explain anything to me during the flight back. He sat in silence, reading reports on a tablet that flickered with symbols I did not recognize. When I asked him directly what prepare meant, he only said one thing: you will understand soon. Everyone will. The transport dropped out of hyperspace near Earth's outer defense line, a region of space that had always looked empty on public star charts. That day, for the first time in my career, I saw it was not empty at all. Shapes uncloaked around us in absolute silence. Dozens, then hundreds, then more than I could count. Massive constructs shaped like nothing the Council had ever displayed in their trade reports. Dark hulls without markings. Weapons platforms disguised for years as harmless asteroids. Automated stations built into empty rock, waiting. I felt my chest tighten as I stared through the viewport. Julian finally spoke again, quietly, almost gently. We knew this day might come since before you were born, Elena. We built quietly. We waited patiently. We let them believe what they wanted to believe. I asked him why. Why hide something like this instead of showing strength from the start? He looked at me with something close to sadness. Because showing strength invites a fight before you are ready for one. Hiding it means the fight only happens on your terms. The transport continued toward Earth, passing silent construction platforms and dark shipyards that had never appeared on any official registry. I realized, watching them slide past the window, that I had spent my entire career serving a nation that was far larger and far more prepared than I had ever imagined. We landed at a base I did not recognize, buried beneath farmland, in a quiet region that looked, from above, like nothing more than fields and rivers. Inside, the halls were full of quiet urgency. Officers moved with purpose, but without panic. Screens displayed positions of council fleets, updated in near real time, tracked by sensors that were never supposed to exist according to any treaty we had signed. I met a woman named Priya Maleen there, an engineer who had spent 15 years designing what she called adaptive defense drones. She showed me footage of a swarm test from 2 years earlier, thousands of small drones responding to a simulated attack, rearranging themselves faster than any council sensor could track. I asked her how long humanity had been preparing weapons like this. She smiled, without any joy in it. Since the moment we realized the council would never see us as equals, only as something to be managed. That night, I could not sleep. I kept replaying Sask Oren's calm voice in my head, the way he delivered an ultimatum like he was reading a weather report. I kept thinking about how easily the other species had underestimated us, how confidently they assumed a young species meant a weak one. Near dawn, Julian called me to a briefing room. A dozen officers sat around a table lit by a glowing star map. He explained, without emotion, what would happen next. The council would send a message soon demanding our formal surrender to their terms. When we refused, as everyone in that room already knew we would, the council would send a punishment fleet to one of our border colonies, a place called Haldren's Reach, to make an example of us. Julian tapped the star map, and a small colony blinked into focus. They believe Haldren's Reach is undefended, he said. They believe it is a peaceful farming settlement with no military value. They are wrong. I asked what would happen to the people living there. He looked at me, and for the first time that day, something sharp crossed his expression. They will not be harmed. They already know what is coming. They have trained for this longer than you have been alive. I sat with that information for a long moment, trying to understand what kind of nation could hide a plan this large from its own citizens and yet keep it so carefully organized that no one panicked, no one broke ranks, no one questioned it. Priya answered before I could ask. We are not hiding a weapon, Elena. We are hiding a promise that no one will ever again threaten humanity and expect us to simply accept it. Outside the briefing room, the sky over the base was turning a pale gray, the first light of morning breaking over quiet fields that hid an entire fleet beneath them. Somewhere above us, in orbit, more ships were moving into position, silent, patient, and utterly without mercy for whatever the council decided to send our way. I left that room understanding one thing clearly. Humanity had spent years being patient, careful, and quiet, letting older species believe we were small and harmless. That patience was ending, and whatever came next would not be gentle. The countdown Sask Oren started without knowing it had already begun ticking toward 0. 3 days passed before the council sent its answer, and every one of those days felt longer than the year before it. I spent that time at the base beneath the farmland, watching officers move through corridors with quiet focus, watching engineers run final checks on systems I had never even heard named before that week. I met a pilot named Daniel Ford, a calm man in his 30s who had flown reconnaissance missions along the council border for 6 years without ever firing a weapon. He told me he had trained for a mission like this since he was 19, though he never expected to see it happen in his lifetime. I asked him if he was afraid. He shook his head slowly. Afraid is the wrong word, he said. I have simply been waiting. On the 4th day, the council's formal response arrived through the same channel that had carried the earlier ultimatum. Sask Oren appeared again, his silver face calm and untroubled, as though he already knew how the conversation would end. He said the council had reviewed humanity's silence as a refusal. He said refusal required correction. He said a fleet would arrive at Haldren's Reach within a standard week to demonstrate what happens to species who ignore the will of the council. He called it a lesson. I watched the recording twice, trying to understand how a being who had lived for centuries could speak about causing suffering to an entire settlement with the same tone he might use to describe adjusting a trade agreement. Julian Ashcombe watched the same recording beside me without any visible reaction. When it ended, he simply said one word: "Good." I asked him what he meant by that. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "It means they are exactly where we need them to be, confident, careless, and blind." I began to understand, over the following days, just how long humanity had spent preparing for this exact moment. I learned that Haldren's Reach was not an ordinary colony at all, but one of dozens of settlements built specifically to appear peaceful from orbit, while hiding advanced defense systems beneath quiet fields and calm rivers, much like the base where I now stood. Priya Maline showed me detailed schematics of the colony's true structure. Beneath the visible farmhouses and grain silos sat automated platforms capable of detecting an incoming fleet from a great distance, calculating its formation, and responding within seconds. She explained that similar colonies existed along every border humanity shared with the wider galaxy, each one a quiet trap disguised as an easy target. I asked her how the people living there felt about their homes doubling as hidden fortresses. She told me most of them had volunteered for exactly that reason, understanding that peace only lasts as long as your enemies believe attacking you costs more than it gains. On the 5th day, I met a woman named Nadia Cole, a strategist who had spent years studying the Council's military doctrine. She explained to me, calmly and clearly, why humanity had chosen silence over open displays of strength for so long. She said older species, like those in the Council, valued order above almost everything else. They believed technology should advance slowly, carefully, and only under supervision. They believed young species like humanity should remain small, dependent, and easy to guide. Humanity had let them believe exactly that, year after year, while quietly building something far larger beneath the surface. I asked her if she ever felt guilty about the deception. She looked at me steadily. "Do you feel guilty for locking your door at night, Elena? We were never lying. We were simply protecting ourselves from those who would take advantage of open honesty." As the days passed, I noticed something changing in myself as well. The fear I had felt in the council chamber slowly gave way to something calmer, something closer to certainty. I began attending strategy briefings not as an outside observer, but as someone trying to understand the full shape of the plan. I learned that humanity's fleet had grown far beyond anything listed in official council records. Hidden shipyards near distant moons had spent decades constructing vessels using technology gathered from careful, quiet study of every species humanity had ever encountered. Engineers had studied council weapons, council shields, and council sensors, then built systems designed specifically to counter each one. I asked Nadia how humanity managed to hide shipyards large enough to build fleets like that without the council noticing. She smiled faintly. "Because the council never imagined we were capable of hiding anything that large. Arrogance is a wonderful shield, as long as you are not the one wearing it." On the 6th day, reports began arriving from long-range sensors near Haldren's Reach. The Council fleet had entered the outer system, moving with slow, confident formation, clearly expecting no resistance at all. Their ships broadcast a simple message toward the colony below, informing the residents that their settlement was about to receive a lesson in respect for galactic order. I watched the recording of that broadcast in the command center, surrounded by officers who showed no fear at all. Daniel Ford stood near me, arms crossed, watching the same screen with quiet focus. I asked him what the pilots stationed near the colony were doing at that exact moment. He told me they were waiting, exactly as they had trained to do for years, letting the council fleet believe it faced nothing but empty farmland and frightened settlers. That evening, Julian gathered the senior officers, myself included, into the main briefing room one final time before the operation began. He explained the plan in simple terms. The colony's hidden defense systems would remain silent until the council fleet committed fully to its approach. Only then would the true nature of Haldren's Reach reveal itself. He said the goal was not simply defense. It was demonstration, a message delivered so clearly that no species in the galaxy would ever again assume humanity was an easy target. I asked him what would happen to the Council soldiers aboard those ships once the defense systems activated. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "They chose to come here to enforce an unjust order, Elena. We offered peace once, and it was answered with threats. We will not offer it twice in the same conversation." I felt a chill at those words, not because I disagreed, but because I understood, for the first time, exactly how far humanity was willing to go to protect itself. There would be no warning shots, no negotiation once the battle began, no mercy extended to those who arrived, intending to show none themselves. That night, I stood on the observation platform above the base, watching the stars through reinforced glass, knowing that somewhere far above us, a fleet of confident, unsuspecting ships was drifting closer to a colony that had been waiting for this exact moment for years. I thought about Sask Oren's calm voice, delivering threats like weather reports. I thought about the officers around me, disciplined and unafraid, preparing not for conquest, but for a reckoning they had been quietly building toward for longer than I had known them. The countdown that began in that council chamber days earlier had reached its final hours, and nothing about what followed would be gentle, careful, or slow. The council fleet crossed into the inner system of Haldren's Reach, exactly as our sensors predicted, moving in slow, confident formation, broadcasting warnings toward a colony they believed had no way to answer them. I stood in the command center beneath the farmland base, watching the same feed as dozens of officers around me. No one spoke. No one needed to. Every screen displayed the same simple truth. The council believed they were approaching an easy target. They were wrong, and they were about to learn exactly how wrong in a matter of minutes. Daniel Ford sat at a console nearby, hands steady on the controls of a drone squadron stationed near the colony's outer ring. Priya Maleen monitored the automated defense platforms hidden beneath quiet farmland, waiting for the exact moment the council fleet would commit fully to its approach. Nadia Cole stood near the main map table, arms crossed, watching enemy ship formations with the calm focus of someone who had studied this exact scenario for years. Julian Ashcombe stood at the center of it all, silent, waiting. The council fleet slowed as it neared the colony, clearly expecting to see frightened settlers, or perhaps a small unarmed defense force, ready to surrender. Instead, the surface of Haldren's Reach remained calm and quiet, farmhouses glowing softly under starlight, rivers reflecting the light of distant ships above. Then the ground opened. Dozens of hidden platforms rose from beneath grain fields and riverbanks, revealing weapons systems that had never once appeared on any council scan of the region. Automated defense stations activated in perfect coordination, locking onto every ship in the approaching fleet within seconds. Above the colony, cloaked constructs that Council sensors had registered as harmless asteroids for years suddenly revealed their true nature, moving into position with terrifying precision. I watched Daniel's hands move across his console, releasing drone swarms that had been resting silently in deep space nearby. Thousands of small, fast constructs surged toward the Council fleet, rearranging their formation faster than any defense system could track. The Council ships attempted to respond, shifting shields, adjusting formation, broadcasting confused messages demanding explanation. Sask Oren's voice crackled through our monitoring channel, no longer calm, no longer certain, demanding to know how a colony he believed defenseless could suddenly reveal weapons far beyond anything the Council had ever detected from humanity. No one answered him. Priya activated the automated platforms fully, and the true scale of Haldren's Reach became clear. What appeared from orbit as a quiet farming settlement was, in truth, one of the most heavily defended positions in the entire region, built specifically to appear harmless, while hiding capability far beyond anything the Council had prepared for. I watched the battle unfold across multiple screens, each one displaying a different angle of the engagement. Council ships attempted to retreat, only to find their paths blocked by drone formations moving with impossible coordination. Shield systems that had protected Council vessels in past conflicts failed to hold against weapons specifically designed, over years of quiet study, to exploit their exact weaknesses. Nadia Cole spoke quietly beside me, narrating details I did not fully understand, referencing weapon types and defense patterns with the calm tone of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as expected. She said humanity had studied Council shield technology for over a decade, learning its patterns from trade demonstrations and diplomatic exchanges that seemed harmless at the time. Every weapon deployed that night had been designed specifically to counter those exact defenses. I asked her how long the battle would take. She told me it had already been decided before it began. The only question remaining was how long the Council ships would continue trying to fight before their systems failed completely. The answer came sooner than I expected. Within 20 minutes, more than half the Council fleet had lost power to their main systems, drifting helplessly as drone swarms continued their coordinated assault. Ships that attempted to retreat found themselves surrounded by hidden platforms that had risen from the colony below, cutting off every possible escape route with calm, mechanical precision. I watched one Council vessel attempt to broadcast a message of surrender, hoping for the kind of negotiated retreat that Council military doctrine had always guaranteed in past conflicts between older species. Julian watched the same message appear on our main screen, his expression unreadable. He said nothing. He gave no order to accept the surrender. He simply continued watching as the automated systems carried out exactly what they had been designed to do. I felt something tighten in my chest as I understood what was happening. This was not a battle meant to end in negotiation. This was a demonstration meant to remove any doubt, in the mind of every species watching from a distance, about what would happen to those who threatened humanity and expected to walk away unharmed. I asked Julian directly why we would not accept a surrender that seemed genuine. He turned to me, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. Because the moment we accept a false peace, they will return with a larger fleet, believing our mercy is a weakness they can exploit again. We offered peace once, before any of this began. It was answered with threats. This is the answer to those threats. I did not argue with him. I understood in that moment exactly what kind of choice humanity had made long before I ever stood in that command center. This was not a decision made in anger. It was a decision made with cold, careful calculation, designed specifically to end any future temptation the Council might feel to test humanity's limits again. The battle continued for nearly an hour, though the outcome had been clear from the very first moments. Council ships drifted powerless across the system, their weapons silenced, their shields collapsed, their crews left with no path forward and no path back. The automated platforms beneath Haldren's reach continued their methodical work without hesitation, without emotion, and without any sign of the mercy that Council doctrine had always assumed would be extended by a younger, supposedly weaker species. When the last Council vessel fell silent, the command center around me remained quiet, none of the officers celebrating, none of them speaking loudly or expressing relief. Daniel Ford simply lowered his hands from the console, staring at the now empty display where enemy formations had been moments before. Priya Malin closed the connection to the automated platforms, her expression calm but tired, the look of someone who had spent years preparing for a single mission that had finally arrived and finally ended. Nadia Cole turned to me, her voice steady. "This is not the end, Elena. This is the message. Everything that follows depends on how the rest of the galaxy chooses to respond to it." Julian gave a single order before the room fully settled. He instructed communications to send a short recording of the battle's final moments directly to the Council chamber, unedited, unexplained, accompanied by a single message. The message read simply, "This is what consideration looks like." I stood in the quiet command center long after the officers around me returned to their duties, staring at the star map that now showed an empty region where a Council fleet had once approached with total confidence. I thought about Sask Oren's calm voice delivering an ultimatum days earlier, certain that humanity would eventually bow to pressure the way every young species before us had done. I understood now that humanity had never intended to bow at all. We had simply waited, patiently and quietly, for the exact moment when our silence would speak louder than any negotiation ever could. Somewhere far beyond our system, the Council would soon receive that recording, and the galaxy would begin to understand exactly what kind of species they had spent decades underestimating. Word of Haldren's reach spread through the Council chambers faster than anyone in our command center expected, and the response arrived not as words this time, but as movement. Within 2 days, long-range sensors detected a massive gathering of Council ships near a neutral border station, far larger than the fleet that had approached the colony before. Nadia Cole stood over the main map table, watching the formation grow hour by hour, her expression sharp and focused. She explained to me that the Council leadership refused to believe a single colony could defeat one of their fleets without outside help. They assumed sabotage, or perhaps a hidden alliance with another species willing to lend humanity advanced weapons. Rather than pause to investigate carefully, their pride pushed them toward a larger, more forceful response, believing overwhelming numbers would surely correct whatever had gone wrong. Julian Ashcombe called another briefing that evening, gathering senior officers around the same table where I had first learned about the plan for Haldren's reach. This time, the star map displayed a battle line far larger than before, stretching across multiple systems along humanity's border with the Council's territory. He explained that this new fleet intended to strike not just one colony, but several at once, hoping to overwhelm our defenses through sheer numbers before we could react. He said the Council believed our victory at Haldren's Reach had come from a single, isolated weapon system, something they could counter with mass rather than strategy. I asked him how humanity intended to respond to a fleet so much larger than the one before. He answered simply, by showing them exactly how wrong they are about the word isolated. Over the following hours, I learned the true scale of what humanity had built while pretending to remain small and dependent. Hidden shipyards near distant moons, similar to the ones Priya Maline had once described to me, began releasing vessels that had been under construction for years, some of them larger than anything I had ever seen listed in Council military records. Daniel Ford showed me footage from one such shipyard, revealing rows of dark-hulled vessels emerging from asteroid fields that Council scans had registered as empty rock for over a decade. He told me humanity had built these ships not for conquest, but for exactly this moment, understanding that a threat delayed was still a threat, and one day it would need to be answered fully. I asked him how it felt, seeing so much hidden strength finally revealed. He considered the question carefully before answering. It feels like relief, honestly, like finally being allowed to stop pretending. As our fleets moved into position, reports began arriving from unexpected sources. Smaller species who had long lived under Council oversight began sending quiet messages toward human channels, some expressing fear at the growing conflict, others expressing something closer to hope. Nadia showed me one such message from a small trading collective near the Council border, asking cautiously whether humanity intended to extend the same treatment shown at Haldren's Reach toward species who had never threatened us directly. Julian answered that message personally, assuring the collective that humanity's response was aimed only at those who chose violence first, not at species seeking peaceful coexistence. He explained to me afterward that many smaller species had lived for generations under quiet pressure from the Council, forced into agreements that limited their growth and independence, much like the terms demanded of humanity days earlier. I began to understand that this conflict was no longer only about humanity's survival. It had become a moment that other species across the region were watching closely, waiting to see whether an old and powerful authority could truly be challenged and overcome. The Council fleet advanced slowly over the following day, moving with far more caution than before, clearly wary after the losses at Haldren's Reach. Sensors detected additional support ships joining their formation, vessels equipped with stronger shields and reinforced hulls, likely modified quickly in response to whatever fragments of information the Council had gathered from the earlier battle. Priya Maline studied these modifications carefully, adjusting our own weapon systems in response. She explained to me that humanity's designs were never static, built instead to adapt quickly based on new information, much like the drone swarms used at Haldren's Reach, capable of rearranging themselves faster than any enemy could predict. I asked her whether she believed the Council could ever truly catch up to humanity's pace of innovation. She shook her head slowly. Not as long as they believe their age gives them wisdom rather than habit. Habit is slow, Elena. We were built by necessity to move fast, and necessity does not wait for anyone's permission. The main confrontation began at the edge of a quiet system near humanity's border, a location chosen specifically because it offered wide open space for our larger fleet to maneuver freely. I stood once again in the command center, watching the same calm focus from every officer around me, none of them showing fear, none of them showing excitement, only quiet readiness for what was about to happen. Daniel Ford led a squadron of pilots stationed at the forward edge of our formation, his voice steady over the comm channel as he coordinated movement with dozens of other ships. Nadia Cole monitored enemy formations from the main table, calling out adjustments as the Council fleet shifted its approach in response to our positioning. Julian stood at the center of the room, watching everything unfold with the same quiet certainty he had shown before the battle at Haldren's Reach. When the Council fleet finally committed to its attack, our ships responded with the same calculated precision that had ended the previous engagement so quickly. Shield systems, redesigned specifically to counter the reinforcements the Council had added, held firm against attacks that would have overwhelmed our defenses only days earlier. Weapons platforms targeted engine systems and command vessels with careful precision, disabling ships rather than wasting time attempting to negotiate their surrender. I watched several Council commanders attempt to broadcast messages partway through the battle, offering terms, offering retreat, offering promises of future negotiation. Julian allowed the messages to be recorded, but gave no order to pause the engagement. He explained quietly, without looking away from the battle unfolding on screen, that humanity had already extended an offer of peaceful negotiation once, before any of this conflict began, and that offer had been answered with threats rather than respect. He said the Council needed to understand fully, without any ambiguity, that humanity's patience had limits, and once those limits were crossed, there would be no return to gentle diplomacy mid-conflict. The battle continued for just under 2 hours, longer than the engagement at Haldren's Reach due to the larger number of ships involved, but the outcome remained just as clear from the earliest moments. Council vessels, unable to match the adaptability of our defense systems, gradually lost power across their formation, drifting helplessly, much like the fleet before them. When the final Council ship fell silent, the command center remained quiet once again. No cheering, no celebration, only the steady sound of officers closing communication channels and logging the results of the engagement. Nadia turned to me afterward, her expression calm but thoughtful. The Council will not recover quickly from this. Their entire authority rests on the belief that no species under their oversight can challenge them successfully. We have now proven that belief false twice in less than 2 weeks. I asked her what she believed would happen next. She looked toward the star map, now displaying a wide stretch of quiet space where 2 Council fleets had once approached with total confidence. Now, she said, we find out whether the rest of the galaxy still believes the Council deserves the authority they have held for so long. Julian ordered a final message sent toward the Council chamber that evening, accompanied by full recordings of both engagements, along with a simple statement informing them that humanity would welcome peaceful cooperation with any species willing to offer it honestly, but would no longer accept threats disguised as diplomacy from any authority, regardless of its age or its history. I stood again on the observation platform above the base that night, staring at the same stars I had watched days earlier before the first battle began. The fear I once felt in that Council chamber had fully given way to something steady and certain, a quiet understanding that humanity had chosen, long before I ever learned the truth, to never again stand in a room and be told what we were allowed to become. 3 weeks passed before the Council sent another message, and when it finally arrived, it did not sound like the voice that had once delivered an ultimatum with such calm certainty. Sask Orin appeared on the screen again, though he looked different this time, his silver features drawn tight, his usual composure replaced by something closer to caution. He did not speak of correction. He did not speak of oversight or limits or permission. He asked, quietly, whether humanity would agree to a meeting to discuss what he called a new understanding between our species and the Council. Julian Ashcombe watched the message beside me in the same command center where I had spent the last month of my life. When it ended, he turned to Nadia Cole and asked for her assessment. She said the Council's authority had weakened significantly since the two battles, with several smaller species along the border openly questioning whether the old order still deserved their loyalty. She believed the request for a meeting was less about respect and more about survival, an attempt to preserve whatever influence the Council had left before it crumbled entirely. Julian considered this for a long moment before deciding that humanity would attend the meeting, though not as a defendant answering to judges, but as an equal voice at the table for the first time in our history among the stars. I was chosen to accompany him, along with Nadia and a small security detail, traveling to a neutral station near the border where the meeting would take place. The journey felt different from the one I had taken weeks earlier toward the original council chamber. There was no dread in my chest this time, no uncertainty about what might happen if the meeting went poorly. I understood, without needing to be told, that humanity now held the advantage in any conversation that followed. The neutral station was smaller than the Grand Council chamber I remembered, its halls quiet and tense, as delegates from dozens of species gathered to witness what many expected to be a historic shift in galactic authority. I noticed representatives from smaller species standing near the edges of the main hall, watching with cautious curiosity rather than the polite disinterest I remembered from my first visit weeks earlier. Sask Orin greeted us formally when we entered, his tone measured but noticeably softer than before. He introduced several other council members I did not recognize, delegates who seemed to have replaced others removed from leadership following the failures at Haldren's Reach and the larger battle that followed. Julian responded politely but firmly, making clear from the very beginning of the meeting that humanity had not come to negotiate limits on our growth or our defenses. We had come to establish new terms entirely, ones that reflected the reality the Council had been forced to witness firsthand. The discussion that followed lasted several hours, covering topics ranging from trade agreements to shared research to the treatment of smaller species who had long lived under strict Council oversight. Nadia handled much of the technical negotiation, calmly outlining boundaries that humanity considered non-negotiable, including full independence over our own defense research and complete rejection of any future oversight committee similar to the one proposed weeks earlier. I watched Sask Orin's expression carefully throughout the meeting, noticing how often he glanced toward the smaller species representatives seated nearby, clearly aware that his own authority now depended partly on how gracefully he accepted terms he would never have considered acceptable only a month before. At one point, a delegate from a smaller species I did not recognize spoke up during a pause in the discussion, asking humanity directly whether we intended to replace the Council as the dominant authority in the region, simply exchanging one form of control for another. Julian answered without hesitation, his voice calm and clear enough that every delegate in the room could hear him. "We do not want authority over other species," he said. "We want the freedom to grow without threat, and we want that same freedom respected for every species willing to extend the same respect toward others. What we destroyed was not a government. It was a belief that fear could be used to control growth. We have no interest in replacing that belief with our own version of the same mistake." The room remained quiet after he spoke, and I noticed several of the smaller species delegates exchanging glances, some cautiously hopeful, others still uncertain whether to trust a species capable of the kind of overwhelming response we had shown weeks earlier. The meeting concluded with a new agreement, one that removed the previous restrictions placed on humanity entirely, while also establishing protections for smaller species seeking independence from Council oversight if they chose to pursue it. The Council retained a role in the region, though a far more limited one, focused primarily on mediating disputes rather than enforcing strict control over growth and technology. As we prepared to leave the station, Sask Orin approached me privately, his expression unreadable in a way that reminded me of our very first meeting weeks earlier. He asked me quietly whether humanity had always intended for the conflict to unfold exactly as it had, or whether events had simply moved faster than anyone expected. I considered the question carefully before answering honestly. I told him I believed humanity had never wanted a conflict at all, but had understood clearly, long before I ever learned the truth myself, that peace offered without strength behind it was rarely respected by those unwilling to offer the same peace in return. He nodded slowly, saying nothing further, before turning to rejoin the remaining council delegates still gathered in quiet conversation near the main hall. On the journey home, I sat beside Julian in silence for a long while, watching the stars shift outside the viewport, thinking about everything that had changed since the day I first stood in that council chamber, listening to an ultimatum delivered with total confidence. I asked him, finally, whether he believed the peace we had secured would last. He thought about the question for a long moment before answering. Peace never lasts because of promises, Elena. It lasts because both sides understand clearly what breaking it will cost. The Council understands that cost now. Whether that understanding remains depends entirely on whether we continue reminding them of it, quietly and firmly, for as long as necessary. We returned to Earth several days later, greeted not with celebration, but with the same quiet, steady calm I had witnessed throughout the entire conflict. There were no parades, no announcements filled with pride or triumph. Instead, life continued much as it always had. Farmers working their fields above hidden defense platforms, engineers continuing quiet research in shipyards, disguised as empty asteroid fields, officers returning to ordinary lives after extraordinary duty. I stood once more on an observation platform, this time overlooking Earth itself rather than a distant base, watching the sun rise slowly over quiet oceans and green fields that had, only weeks earlier, hidden an entire fleet capable of reshaping the balance of power across the galaxy. I thought about Sask Orin's calm voice, delivering an ultimatum, certain that humanity would bow the way every young species before us had done. I thought about the quiet officers who trained for years without ever expecting to use what they had built. I thought about Julian's steady certainty, Nadia's careful strategy, Priya's patient engineering, and Daniel's calm readiness, each of them representing a piece of a plan built not from anger, but from a simple, quiet determination to never again be underestimated. Humanity had not sought conquest. We had not sought to rule over other species or replace one form of control with another. We had simply refused, finally and completely, to remain the weaker voice in any room, the smaller presence in any negotiation, the species expected to accept limits placed on us by those who assumed age alone granted the right to decide our future. The galaxy watched us differently now, with caution where there had once been condescension, with respect where there had once been quiet dismissal. Some species still feared what humanity had become, while others quietly hoped to learn from what we had built, understanding perhaps for the first time that strength, when used carefully and only in answer to threat, could reshape an entire region without ever needing to claim dominance over it. I stood there a long while, watching the sunrise stretch across the horizon, understanding finally what humanity's true philosophy had always been, hidden quietly beneath fields and rivers and patient years of preparation. We had never wanted to be feared. We had only ever refused to be small.